Chapter 1. A Note in the Fog. It was a grey and listless morning in late October when I received the summons that would usher Holmes and me into one of the most curious cases of our shared career. London lay shrouded in a damp fog thick as suet pudding, curling in silent eddies around the gas lamps and softening the hard outlines of the waking city. My breakfast had just arrived at the table, and I had barely unfolded the Times when Mrs. Hudson bustled into my lodging with a telegram in hand and an urgency in her eyes. "From Mr. Holmes, Doctor. He says it's important." I took the folded paper and opened it with mild anticipation. Our adventures together had grown fewer of late, and I welcomed the notion of another investigation. The message was brief and unmistakably in Holmes's hand. "Come at once. Bring your bag. Though there is no ailment to mend. A man has vanished in curious fashion. Only his violin remains. S.H." I dressed at once. Curiosity piqued. The note was cryptic even by Holmes's usual standards, but the mention of a violin struck a musical chord with me. Holmes's love of the instrument was well known, both to me and, regrettably, to the tenants of Baker Street. By the time I reached 221B, the fog had thickened to a kind of soup, and the sound of horse hooves echoed with a peculiar dampness through the empty streets. Holmes was awaiting me, not at the window, as was his usual habit, but cross-legged on the rug, in the centre of the sitting room, his eyes closed, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The familiar scent of tobacco was absent. Instead, the air held a dry, mineral tang I could not place. "You've come," he said, without opening his eyes. "Excellent. Your punctuality is as reliable as the tides." I looked up. "No name, no address, just initials." Holmes gave a wry smile. "Leopold Rivington, first violinist of the Covent Garden Symphony, acclaimed virtuoso, a man as much admired for his interpretations of Paganini as he is feared for his ferocious temper." "Vanished, you say?" "You mentioned a vanishing," I said, placing my bag on the table. "And something about a violin?" Holmes nodded slowly and finally opened his eyes. They were sharp, clear and glinting with a suppressed excitement that I had seen only in the presence of a truly baffling enigma. He rose with grace and handed me a creased envelope. "Read this, Watson, then tell me what you make of it." The paper within was of good stock, the writing elegant, precise. "He has disappeared from his dressing room. The performance was to begin in 20 minutes. All that remains is his violin and a trail of salt. L.R. "Vanished," Holmes confirmed, "without coat, hat, or instrument. Left behind a scene both theatrical and baffling. I've taken the liberty of notifying Inspector Lestrade. He will meet us at the theatre shortly. Time is of the essence." I reached for my coat. "Is there a suggestion of foul play?" "That is what we must determine," Holmes said, taking up his own long coat and cane. "A violinist missing from a locked dressing room, a trail of Epsom salts upon the floor, and a cracked mirror. If it is a performance, it is one with alarming conviction." We took a hansom through the fog-choked streets, the wheels hissing softly over damp cobblestones. As we approached Covent Garden, the gas lamps flared orange through the mist, giving the theatre an eerie, ghost-like quality. A small crowd had gathered near the stage entrance, murmuring in subdued tones. Holmes and I were admitted by a red-faced stage manager who greeted us with anxious gestures. "This way, Mr. Holmes. Thank heaven you're here. The orchestra's in a state, the conductor's threatening to cancel the matinee, and the press have already caught wind of the story." He led us swiftly through a maze of corridors until we reached a small dressing room tucked behind the stage. The door bore a brass plate engraved simply with the letter R. Inside, the room was in mild disarray. A chair was overturned near the dressing table, A mirror had a spiderweb crack across one corner, and on a small divan rested a sleek, black violin case. The case was open. The violin itself lay within, perfectly unharmed, its strings gleaming faintly in the weak light. But the most curious detail by far was the line of white substance running from the center of the room to the wall opposite the window. Upon closer inspection, it formed a neat, narrow trail, neither spilled nor scattered, but poured with deliberate care. Holmes crouched beside it, pinching a grain between his fingers and bringing it thoughtfully to his lips. "Not salt in the culinary sense," he murmured. "Epsom salt, a mineral compound, often used in medicine or ritual." "Ritual?" I repeated, puzzled. "Indeed! A line of Epsom salt is believed by some to possess protective qualities. It may be intended to ward something off or to keep something in." The window was open, but there were no footprints on the sill, nor was there any sign of disturbance in the alley below. Rivington's hat and coat hung by the door, untouched. If the violinist had fled of his own accord, he had done so unprepared for the October chill. Holmes examined the violin next, lifting it with the tenderness of a father holding a child. He plucked a single string and nodded to himself. "In tune," he said. He left it expecting to return. He turned then to the cracked mirror, examining it with a small magnifying lens. "A recent break? No signs of impact? Perhaps a stress fracture, but perhaps something else." I observed the single faint footprint near the dressing table, an angular impression in the dust, not shaped like any common boot. Holmes followed my gaze. "Good eye, Watson. That may prove telling." We were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. The manager returned with a woman in a dark green cloak. Her blonde hair was neatly pinned, and her expression calm but strained. "This is Miss Lydia Vane," the manager said. "She was the last to see Rivington before he disappeared." Holmes gestured for her to sit. "Miss Vane, you may speak freely. What precisely did you observe?" "I came to collect him for rehearsal," she said. Her voice was like a distant melody, restrained, elegant. The door was ajar. I knocked, then entered. The mirror was broken. The violin was still there. And there was salt on the floor. Was Mr. Rivington superstitious? She hesitated. But he had been different lately. In what way? He said he felt watched, not followed precisely, just that someone was always near. It began a few weeks ago. At first, he joked about it, but then he stopped laughing. And yesterday he told me he had heard someone whistling the E minor scale in the theatre when no one else was around. Holmes stood slowly, a distant look in his eyes. "Miss Vane," he said, "you have been most helpful. And though I hope it is not the case, I believe you may soon find yourself in danger." "In danger?" she whispered. Holmes turned back to the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing. "We are dealing," he said quietly, "with a mind that does not think in linear terms. A performer, perhaps, but one whose stage is not the theatre, but the very idea of fear." Chapter 2. The Man with Green Gloves. Holmes and I stood for a long moment after Miss Vane departed, the air in the dressing room growing heavier, as though it too awaited his next utterance. "She is not telling us everything," Holmes said at last, brushing a finger along the edge of the cracked mirror. "Did you note the tremor in her voice when she spoke of the whistling?" "I did," I replied. She seemed genuinely unnerved. "Indeed, but there is more than fear at work. There is guilt, or perhaps grief prematurely worn." We left the dressing room in silence, Holmes deep in thought, his gaze flicking from corridor to corridor, as though the very walls might whisper secrets. The theatre, grand though it appeared to the public, had behind its curtains the usual underbelly of shadows and scurrying figures, stage hands muttering in corners, costumers rushing with armfuls of velvet and lace, and the faint but persistent scent of candle grease and cold paint. Inspector Lestrade was waiting for us in the foyer, dressed in his usual brown overcoat and bowler hat, a look of skepticism already on his face. "Holmes," he greeted, arms folded. "Disappearing musicians now, is it?" Holmes nodded amiably. "A welcome departure from jewel thieves and blackmailers, wouldn't you say?" Lestrade's eyes narrowed. "I've got half the orchestra ready to swear he's been abducted by spirits. You'll forgive me if I lean toward a more earthly explanation." "As do I," Holmes said calmly. "But let us not rule out the symbolic where the literal lacks footing." Lestrade snorted. "Any actual leads, then?" Holmes considered. "A trail of Epsom salts, a cracked mirror, a missing man and an untouched violin. The final person to see him is concealing something, and there's this." He held up a scrap of dark green fabric, no longer than a matchstick, which he had plucked from the latch of the window. Lestrade raised an eyebrow. "Cloak lining." "Possibly, or glove fabric, worn velvet, slightly perfumed. Not Rivington's, I think. Too small." "You mean the woman?" "I mean someone who wished to be invisible, and yet left this behind." Holmes turned to me. "Come, Watson, let us speak to the stagehand who reported the violin first. A man who arrives early, yet notices the absence of a performer before the conductor does. Such a person merits attention." We found the man, a burly, soot-fingered fellow named Cyril Hatch, in a backstage stairwell, coiling a length of cable with deliberate care. He was in his 50s, with a flattened nose and a black smudge across his temple. He eyed Holmes warily. "Didn't nick nothing, if that's what you're thinking," he said by way of greeting. "Mr. Hatch," Holmes said smoothly, "you have the honor of being the first to observe that Mr. Rivington had disappeared. Would you recount exactly what led you to that conclusion?" Hatch shrugged, wiping his hands on a stained rag. "I bring him his lemon water every matinee just before warm-up. He's particular like that, wants it cold, not icy, no seeds. Door was ajar when I got there. I called in, but no answer. I saw the fiddle case, but no sign of him. Then I saw that line of powder, thought someone spilled chalk or something. I went and told the conductor, and told the... Did you enter the room fully?" "Nah, just stuck my head in. Gave me the creeps, it did. Room smelled funny, like herbs or old vinegar." "Did you see anyone else in the corridor at the time?" "Now that you mention it, aye. A tall bloke in a coat too fine for backstage. Gloves, green ones. He was walking like he didn't want to be seen, kept close to the wall. I didn't think much of it. Figured him for some patron, got turned round." Holmes leaned in slightly. "Did you notice his face?" "No, sir. He kept it turned away, but he had a funny limp now that I think of it. Right leg didn't bend right." "A limp, green gloves, and a refined coat," Holmes murmured, almost to himself. "Mr. Hatch, you've been extremely helpful." The stagehand nodded, clearly relieved not to be under suspicion, and returned to his cables. Holmes turned back toward the stairwell, his eyes dancing. "Well, Watson, our man in green grows ever more curious. Velvet gloves, a limp, and a taste for theatrical entrances. This is no ordinary criminal." Back at Baker Street, the day was drawing to a close. The fog had lessened, though not dispersed, and the city carried on under its damp veil. Holmes sank into his armchair with a contented sigh, clasping his long fingers beneath his chin. "I believe," he said, "we must consider two parallel truths. Rivington is either a victim or a voluntary fugitive. but in either case the key is the violin. He gestured toward his desk where Rivington's violin now rested, having been borrowed with the theatre's permission. Holmes opened the case with delicacy and withdrew the instrument, examining it once again in the light of the window. "Note the absence of rosin dust on the bridge," he said. "And yet the strings are taut and polished. Rivington had cleaned it recently, perhaps the night before." He then reached inside the case and drew out the padded lining, lifting it gently to reveal a false compartment beneath. "Aha," he breathed. Inside was a folded piece of parchment, tied with a violet ribbon. Holmes opened it, revealing a fragment of musical notation. 8 bars in a strange minor key, accompanied by a scrawled signature. A. von R. "Von Roon," Holmes said, "an obscure composer, Austrian, died in disgrace after being accused of plagiarism, never proved." "And this music?" I asked. "A fragment of one of his lost works, or so it seems. But what is it doing hidden beneath Rivington's violin?" "Could it be a forgery?" I suggested. Holmes nodded. "That or a clue. Either way, someone believed this composition worth concealing, and someone else, perhaps our man with the green gloves, wants it retrieved." He reached for his violin and began to play the notes written on the parchment. The melody that emerged was haunting, curiously discordant, full of tension that never resolved. It sent a chill through me. When he finished, he turned to me with a rare glint of unease in his eyes. "Watson, that tune is no ordinary composition. It is a cipher, a message in music." "A musical code?" "Precisely. And the choice of von Roon is not accidental. He was said to have hidden messages in his concertos, messages for secret societies, for revolutionaries, for lovers, depending on whom you believe." "So what is this one?" "That," Holmes said, "is what we must determine before someone else does." There was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, a telegram in her hand. "It's for Mr. Holmes, from the theatre." He took it and read aloud. "Another violinist gone, second chair this time, left behind sheet music and a pair of green gloves." L. Holmes stood up in a flash, his calm now coloured with urgency. "They are accelerating. What was artful mystery is becoming serial abduction. Or worse, someone is sending a message, Watson, and we are running out of time to read it." Chapter 3. A Shadow at the Orpheum. By the following morning, a cold drizzle had settled over London like a damp shroud. The mist hung thick along the Thames, obscuring all but the faintest outlines of bridges and towers. Holmes, never one to be deterred by weather, was already dressed and pacing the drawing-room by the time I entered with the morning paper. "2 disappearances," he said, without preamble. "Both violinists, both members of the same orchestra, both vanish without struggle or sound, and in both cases an article left behind." I handed him the paper. The Morning Chronicle had already caught wind of the story. The headline read, "Phantom of the Orpheum, Musicians Vanish Without Trace." "Ah, the press never fails to amplify a mystery," Holmes muttered. "Soon we'll have séances in the green room and ghost stories from every usher." "Lestrade's message was brief," I said. "He mentioned that the second violinist, Miss Rowena Vale, disappeared just after the evening performance. Her gloves and a page of sheet music were found in her dressing room." "Green gloves again, Watson," Holmes murmured, tapping his fingers on the armrest. "But this time they are hers. That is significant." "Why so?" "Because our shadow left green gloves at the first scene, gloves not belonging to Rivington. Now we find gloves again, but of the victim. Are they meant to echo the first clue, or to mislead?" I shook my head. "So we have one musician missing and another vanished the very next night, and in both cases, music left behind." "Indeed, but the similarity may be superficial. Consider the deeper patterns. Holmes rose and crossed to the desk, where he had pinned both sheets of music side by side. One was the Von Roon fragment we had discovered in Rivington's violin case. The other, brought by Lestrade earlier that morning, was the sheet left behind in Miss Vale's room. Holmes studied them in silence, then gave a low whistle. "See here, Watson, the tempo markings. Both are andante with the same curious signature, 3 sharps and the instruction in modo sospirando, a rare term." I squinted at the unfamiliar Latin. "In the manner of sighing," Holmes translated. "A musical direction used by composers of the Romantic period to evoke longing, mystery, sometimes mourning." "But what does it signify?" He tapped the margins. "There are faint notations in pencil along the clef, coordinates perhaps, or a cipher embedded in the phrasing. I suspect these pieces are not music at all, but messages cloaked in harmony. A code? Exactly. It's possible the victims were involved, wittingly or not, in a communication too dangerous to be made in words." There was a knock at the door. Lestrade entered, his coat soaked and hat limp with rain. "You won't believe it," he said without greeting. "I've a man in custody. Name of Benedict Carr. Tall, walks with a limp. Caught trying to slip out the back door of the theatre with a copy of last night's programme and a locked satchel." Holmes's eyes lit with sudden fire. "Does he wear green gloves?" Lestrade blinked. "He does actually. How did you—" "Take me to him at once." At Scotland Yard, Carr sat stiffly in a chair, his long legs stretched before him and his hands folded neatly in his lap. He was perhaps 50, pale, and wore spectacles with smoked lenses. A faded scar creased his left cheekbone, just beneath the eye. He looked more like a schoolmaster than a villain. Holmes sat opposite him. "Mr. Carr," he said, "you have found yourself in unfortunate circumstances. I should like to help you." Carr gave a soft, ironic smile. "I don't imagine Scotland Yard employs philosophers." "Then let us speak plainly. Why were you at the Orpheum last night?" "I enjoy the violin," Carr replied. "Though evidently it does not enjoy me." Holmes steepled his fingers. "You were seen the night before skulking backstage. Your gait is unmistakable. I believe you were present when Albert Rivington disappeared." Carr said nothing. "Your gloves," Holmes went on, "are of fine Austrian velvet. Your coat is Viennese in cut, and yet you are English by birth. You attended King's College, Cambridge, and taught music history before your dismissal 6 years ago." Carr's expression didn't change, but a flicker of surprise crossed his eyes. "You know me, then?" "I know of you," Holmes said, "and of your writings on Von Roon." Carr inhaled sharply. "You believe this is about Von Roon?" Holmes nodded. "There are compositions being circulated, copies made in secret, passed like contraband, hidden messages woven into their bars. Are you their courier or their interpreter?" Carr hesitated, then leaned forward. "I was a scholar once," he said. "Von Roon fascinated me, how he coded rebellion into fugues and wrote elegies for lost causes. I believed he had composed one final work, meant to be destroyed, but it wasn't." He paused. 2 months ago, a man came to me with a fragment of it, a student, or so he claimed. He wanted to know if the music meant something. I examined it. There were embedded patterns, yes, hidden notations, and warnings. Warnings? Carr nodded. Names, dates, events that had not yet occurred. Holmes was still. Prophecies? Predictions? Carr corrected. If you knew how to read them, the music became dangerous. Rivington came into possession of another fragment. Then Miss Vale. They were chosen for a reason. Holmes leaned in. By whom? Carr gave a bitter smile. I don't know. That's why I was at the Orpheum, to intercept the next movement before it reached the wrong hands. I was too late. Lestrade frowned. You expect us to believe musicians are vanishing over sheet music? Carr's eyes sharpened. These are not mere notes, Inspector. This is intelligence, hidden in symphony. It has value far beyond the stage. Holmes stood. We are done here, for now. Come, Watson. Back at Baker Street, Holmes paced for nearly an hour, occasionally snatching his violin and drawing brief, jarring notes across it. At last, he stopped and looked at me. We are approaching this from the wrong angle. How so? We are treating this as a crime within the theatre, but the music extends beyond it. He turned the pages of the second sheet music, then flipped to the back. There, written in red ink, barely visible. Le Jardin de Verre, midnight. What does it mean? Le Jardin de Verre. The Glass Garden, a salon on the edge of Soho, frequented by artists, revolutionaries, and musicians with secrets to trade. We must be there tonight. But is it safe? I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. Watson, nothing worthwhile ever is. Chapter 4. Le Jardin de Verre. That evening, the rain turned to a thin mist veiling the city in a curtain of shadow and light. We left Baker Street shortly after 10, Holmes in one of his more inconspicuous disguises, an overcoat of dull brown, a soft cap low over his brow, and a pipe clenched between his teeth. He had darkened his eyebrows and added a touch of theatrical grease to his cheekbones, giving him the look of a worn-out clerk or wandering scholar. Le Jardin de Verre was not listed in any respectable guidebook. Tucked behind a bookshop on a crooked street near Soho Square, it could be accessed only by a narrow passage flanked with ivy-covered iron gates. Holmes knocked twice, paused, then knocked again in a specific rhythm. A small grille in the door slid open, revealing a single eye. Holmes murmured something in French, and the door creaked open. Inside was a world apart from the fog and filth of London streets. Le Jardin de Verre was a salon of glass and shadow, its walls formed from discarded windows and shattered mirrors, all pieced together into kaleidoscopic patterns. Candles burned in hanging lanterns, their flickering reflections dancing across every surface. The room was filled with the faint aroma of sandalwood and pipe smoke. Artists in tattered velvet debated politics in whispers, while musicians tuned obscure instruments in dim alcoves. We took our place near the back, behind a low table carved from driftwood. Holmes surveyed the room without turning his head, eyes narrowed. "She will be here," he said quietly. "Or someone acting in her stead." "Who?" He did not answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the center of the room, where a small platform had been set up beneath a fractured chandelier. A woman with striking red hair took her place before a harpsichord. Her fingers hovered over the keys, and then she began to play. The melody was delicate, minor in tone, and heartbreakingly sparse. But there was a deliberate quality to it, as though each note had been chosen to convey more than emotion. Holmes sat forward, utterly still. "She's playing the cipher," he whispered. I frowned. "The same as before?" "Number A continuation, a third movement. Someone is pushing the message forward. Listen to the fifth bar, D sharp, A, E, repeated. That's Morse code, D-A-E-E. That's not music, Watson. That's direction." Holmes scribbled something onto a scrap of paper. Then, without warning, he rose and began weaving through the crowd toward the back of the room. I followed, doing my best to remain inconspicuous. We passed beneath a jagged skylight beyond which a full moon shone faintly through the fog. Holmes stopped beside a thin man in a plum-colored suit who had been smoking alone. Without greeting, he said, "The message has shifted." The man looked up slowly. His face was angular, pale, and almost bird-like. He blinked once. "It was never meant for you." Holmes smiled faintly. "And yet it found me. Where is the next piece?" The man reached into his coat and produced a folded page. "You'll find what you seek at the base of the Ferrier obelisk, tonight. Bring no constables." Holmes took the page without hesitation. "One question." "Yes." "Who is orchestrating this?" The man hesitated, then said, "You already know." Before Holmes could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows of the glass garden. Holmes made no move to follow. "Come, Watson," he said, "we must pay our respects to the dead." The Ferrier obelisk stood in the centre of an overgrown cemetery in Highgate, a monument erected in 1781 to a forgotten philanthropist. Its base was surrounded by iron railings, though several had long since rusted away. By the time we arrived, the air was thick with fog and silence. A single lantern burned low near the eastern gate, left there perhaps by a gravedigger or night watchman. Holmes approached the obelisk with cautious steps, scanning the ground. "There," he said, kneeling beside a tuft of weeds. He lifted a small stone and revealed a narrow tube, the kind used to store scrolls or fragile documents. Inside was a page of music, another fragment, written in the same strange notations as the others, but this one was different. "This is a confession," Holmes murmured. "A confession?" "In code, but the structure is unmistakable. The phrasing, the way the measures build, they reveal more than melody. This is a self-incriminating narrative." He pointed to one line, marked with a curious slur, and double clefs. That symbol was used by von Roon to denote betrayal. And here, see this run of descending notes? That's a location. "A grave?" I asked. Holmes nodded. Beneath this very obelisk, using a small crowbar he had concealed in his coat, Holmes pried open a panel in the side of the monument, one that bore signs of recent disturbance. Behind it was a cavity barely large enough to contain a human figure. "That," he said, "is more troubling. She may have been the true target." At that moment, WWE held our breath. Inside was a black case, not a violin case, but a flat rectangular box, bound in aged leather. Holmes opened it. Within lay several pages of sheet music, older than the others, yellowed and marked with wax seals. But there was also something more, a velvet pouch. Holmes opened it gently and drew out a signet ring bearing the crest of the Royal Philharmonic Society. "This," he said grimly, "once belonged to Albert Rivington, so he's dead?" Holmes closed the case slowly. "I don't believe so. This feels theatrical, meant to mislead, a symbol of absence, not of death." "But the second violinist, Miss Vale?" He heard footsteps, slow, careful, deliberate. We turned to see a figure approaching through the mist. It was Miss Evelyn Vane. She looked exhausted, her cloak damp from the fog, eyes bloodshot and wide. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "On the contrary," Holmes said calmly, "this is precisely where we should be." She stepped closer. "You don't understand. This isn't about music. It's about a promise." "To whom?" "To the man I loved," she said, her voice breaking. "Rivington wasn't taken. He ran." "Why?" She reached into her sleeve and pulled out a crumpled note. Holmes unfolded it and read, "Forgive me, Evelyn. They are coming. The music is no longer safe. Hide the second movement, burn the third, and never trust the man with green gloves." Holmes looked up, his eyes sharp. "He's still alive." Evelyn nodded. "He told me to lie, to protect the score. But now they've taken Rowena. I didn't know they'd go that far." "Who are they?" I asked. She looked to Holmes and said a single name. "Marwick!" Holmes went still. Then he said very softly, "So the conductor has taken up his old games again?" I turned in confusion. "You know him?" Holmes nodded. Years ago, he was suspected of trafficking coded intelligence through concerts across the continent. Messages to anarchists, revolutionaries, even foreign agents. But the evidence was insufficient. He vanished until now. And the music? Holmes smiled grimly. Not just art, it is the method, the code, and now he's reassembling it. For whom we do not yet know. He turned to Evelyn. We must find Rivington. Alive, he is the key to this entire performance. I looked up from the armchair. Audiences. He noted their habits, their expressions, where they sat, who they came with, what they whisper. Chapter 5. A Conductor's Shadow. The fog lingered well into the morning, refusing to lift as we returned to Baker Street in silence. Holmes declined both tea and food, clear signs of deep contemplation. He paced the floor with his hands clasped behind his back, his brows drawn as though listening to some music only he could hear. I first heard the name Marwick, Holmes said at last, in Vienna, 1897. He was not yet a conductor then, but a pianist of some local renown. His talents were extraordinary, but his interest in composition was curiously focused on structure, not melody. Obsessive, mathematical, secretive. It is said he kept journals, not of his performances, but of his audiences. That level of observation suggests more than mere vanity. It suggests espionage. You believe he was a spy? Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he retrieved the musical fragments we had collected and laid them across the table like pieces of a jigsaw. He stared at them a moment, then picked up a ruler and compass. This, he murmured, is not a score in the traditional sense. These movements are diagrams, architectural layouts disguised as sheet music. I leaned over. Blueprints? Exactly. He tapped a bar on the third sheet. Here, notice the rhythmic clusters of the first violins. They correspond with the proportions of a particular room. And here, the bass notes reflect the Fibonacci sequence. These are not random artistic choices, they are coordinates, spatial maps. I stared in disbelief. So what is Marwick constructing? Holmes gave a thin smile. That is precisely what I intend to find out. Before I could ask further, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a silver. I stared in disbelief. So what is Marwick constructing? Holmes gave a thin smile. That is precisely what I intend to find out. Before I could ask further, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes took it and unfolded it briskly. As he read, his eyes darkened. It's from Inspector Lestrade. Another disappearance. A man found missing from his study, locked room, no sign of struggle. Only a violin string left curled on the desk. A warning? Or an invitation? A tray. Holmes took it and unfolded it briskly. As he read, his eyes darkened. It's from Inspector Lestrade. Another disappearance. A man found missing from his study. Locked room, no sign of struggle. Only a violin string left curled on the desk. A warning? Or an invitation? In disbelief. So what is Marwick constructing? Holmes gave a thin smile. That is precisely what I intend to find out. Before I could ask further, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes took it and unfolded it briskly. As he read, his eyes darkened. It's from Inspector Lestrade. Another disappearance. A man found missing from his study. Locked room, no sign of struggle. Only a violin string left curled on the desk. A warning? Or an invitation? I stared in disbelief. So what is Marwick constructing? Holmes gave a thin smile. That is precisely what I intend to find out. Before I could ask further, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram on a silver tray. Holmes took it and unfolded it briskly. As he read, his eyes darkened. "It's from Inspector Lestrade, another disappearance. A man found missing from his study. Locked room, no sign of struggle. Only a violin string left curled on the desk. A warning or an invitation." By mid-afternoon, we were en route to the victim's house, an elegant terraced home near Holland Park. Lestrade was waiting for us at the gate, looking rather harried. "Morning, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson. You've come at the right time. Something about this business doesn't sit right. You'll want to see it for yourself." "Tell me about the man," Holmes said as we followed Lestrade up the path. "Name of Benjamin Falk, retired solicitor, lived alone, save for a housekeeper. Last seen last night in his study. This morning she found the door locked, had to call a locksmith to get it open." "And the room?" "Nothing disturbed. Fire gone out, but the string, it's the same kind Miss Vale used on her violin." Holmes entered the study and began his usual sweep. I watched as he crouched beside the window, examined the hinges, checked the ashes in the grate, and peered into the man's bookshelves. Then he stopped and smiled faintly. Ah, he reached into the bookshelf and pulled out a volume of Goethe's Faust. Tucked inside was a folded square of parchment. Another page of music. Holmes handed it to me without comment and turned back to the hearth. He knelt, reached into the grate, and retrieved a scrap of burned paper. "There was a second message," he murmured, destroyed hastily. I glanced at the music sheet. "Another cipher?" "Yes, but this one is incomplete. Deliberately so. Marek is taunting us, Watson, leaving us crumbs and Falk. He was likely one of the patrons underwriting the earlier performances." "You believe he's still alive?" Holmes stood. "I believe he knows too much, and Marek needed to silence him or remove him to a more secure location." "Where?" Holmes smiled. "To find that, we must return to the Royal Hall." That evening we returned to the concert venue where the Rivington Ensemble had last performed. Holmes had arranged for a private inspection under the pretext of retrieving a personal item lost during the prior concert. Inside the great hall, the air was still thick with the scent of polish and rosin. Holmes walked the stage slowly, his eyes scanning the rafters, the curtain ropes, and the spaces between the floorboards. "Do you hear that?" he said suddenly. I paused. "I hear nothing." "Precisely. And yet, this floor, it resonates oddly." He knelt and began tapping the stage with his cane. A few paces in, the sound changed from a solid thud to a faint echo. "A hollow chamber," he said, "not a cellar, a hidden crawl space." With the help of a crowbar from the backstage toolkit, Holmes pried open a trapdoor hidden beneath the conductor's podium. Beneath it, a narrow passage descended into darkness. We lit a lantern and descended carefully. The chamber below was barely tall enough to stand in. Dust clung to every surface. Crates lined the walls, many marked with shipping codes and strange insignias. But what caught our attention was a small table in the center. On it lay a map, a blueprint marked with the very same musical notation as the pages Holmes had deciphered. Holmes ran a hand across the markings. "So this is it, Marek's design." "What does it show?" "Not a building," Holmes said slowly. "An installation, a network. He intends to host a final performance, but the location is not a concert hall. It's a chamber beneath the city itself." Beneath the Thames, I stared. "You mean a performance in the sewers?" "More than that. A signal, Watson. Marwick intends to use acoustics to transmit a hidden message, a signal embedded in the harmonics meant only for those trained to hear it." "A signal to whom?" "To foreign agents, operatives scattered across London. He is attempting to activate something. Or someone. Holmes rolled up the map and turned to me with fierce intensity in his eyes. "We must find the last movement, Watson, the key to the entire composition. Without it, we cannot decode the message or stop the performance." "And where will we find it?" Holmes smiled grimly. "In the one place Marwick believes no one will look." Chapter 6. The Final Note. Before the storm morning in Baker Street brought with it a heavy slate-grey sky and a grim determination in Holmes's eyes. He had scarcely spoken since our return from the concert hall the night before. With the mysterious map in hand and the trapdoor chamber still fresh in our minds, a kind of hush had settled over him, the quiet before the crescendo. At last, he turned from his desk where the map was laid open beside the fragmented musical scores. "The final movement," he said, "was never meant to be hidden in a place of secrecy. Marwick's vanity would not allow it. He is, in his own warped sense, an artist. No true performer hides his masterpiece in darkness." "Then where do we look?" I asked. "In the light, Watson. Or rather, where light and illusion reign supreme." I frowned. "The theatre?" "Not just any theatre," Holmes said, rising and donning his coat. "We are going to the one place in London where illusion is gospel, where sleight of hand and spectacle are worshipped above all else." The Grand Alchemia Theatre was nestled between two drab warehouses in Lambeth, its facade little more than crumbling stone and soot-streaked windows. But inside it was a place of wonder. Gaslight chandeliers glowed dimly above red velvet curtains and golden balconies. It had once housed great illusionists, Mesmero, Dante, and a certain Monsieur Verrall, who claimed to communicate with the spirits of Beethoven and Liszt. "It was here," Holmes whispered, as we stepped into the echoing theatre that Marwick performed under the alias Marc Valerian in his youth, a curious pseudonym, an anagram, in fact. Of what? Carnival Marek, a title used by one of the most obscure composers in Austro-Hungarian circles, a man whose scores were known to contain political satire, hidden messages, and, so it was rumoured, coded instructions to revolutionary factions. "And you think Marwick has returned here?" "Not physically, but I believe he left something behind." Holmes approached the stage and scanned the rear wall, then motioned to the theatre manager who had agreed to let us in. "I require access to the old magician's loft," he said, "above the proscenium." The manager, a stooped man with rheumy eyes, nodded with hesitation. "It's not been touched in 20 years. Dangerous scaffolding, but you'll find the trapdoor just above the curtain rail." Within minutes, we were climbing a narrow, creaking stair behind the stage. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in long strands. When we reached the loft, Holmes paused and inhaled deeply. "Incense," he murmured, "and varnish. Someone has been here recently." We stepped into a cramped room lined with forgotten props, trick mirrors, old instruments, fake coffins, and velvet drapery. At the far end, beneath a faded tapestry, Holmes found a large wooden chest. With deliberate care, he opened it. Inside, nestled beneath yellowed playbills, was a leather-bound folio marked with a single word in gold leaf. "Finale." Holmes opened it with reverence. There it was, the last movement of Marwick's symphony. "It's real," I whispered. Holmes's eyes scanned the sheet. "More than that. This is the activation." "What do you mean?" He held it up to the light. "Every score until now has been a fragment, a section of code, hints toward location, identity, intent. But this is the signal itself, a piece to be played. When performed in full, it will send a precise acoustic pattern through underground spaces, tunnels, pipes, chambers. The resonance will vibrate through key junctions, waking devices, or summoning men. A message? To agents, Watson. cells buried deep within the heart of the city. This is the call to arms. By late afternoon, we had returned to Baker Street and set the folio upon Holmes's desk. He was working quickly now, writing letters, sketching maps, dispatching notes via messenger. I watched him with growing concern. "You believe Marwick means to launch an attack?" "No," Holmes replied, not looking up. "I believe he means to awaken something that has lain dormant. And if he succeeds, the resulting chaos could leave half of London in confusion and the other half in silence." He handed me a paper, a list of names, those known or suspected to have ties to Marwick's old circle, anarchists, dissidents. Several disappeared after the Franco-Prussian War. One turned up in Buenos Aires, another in Prague, all violinists. And the others? Engineers? Acousticians? Tunnellers? A knock interrupted us. It was Lestrade. "You wanted word if anything unusual turned up at the South Bank, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Well, something certainly has." Holmes stood. "Go on." "They've uncovered a set of sealed doors beneath the old printing house on Guff Street, concrete and steel, marked with musical symbols etched into the frame. Our men didn't dare enter without explosives." Holmes's face lit with grim understanding. "Then we are nearly there." That night, with Lestrade and a small team of constables, we descended into the tunnels beneath Gough Street. The air was damp and close. Gas lanterns flickered against the stone, throwing elongated shadows that danced with our every step. At the end of one corridor stood the door Lestrade had spoken of. It was indeed engraved, with symbols matching those on the final movement. Holmes examined the frame. "No lock." "It responds to sound." He pulled from his coat the small, portable violin he often carried for experiments. Then, referencing the score in the folio, he began to play. The notes echoed off the walls like whispers in a cathedral, low, rising, a flourish of harmonic dissonance. And then, a sustained, high A. Something clicked. With a low groan, the doors slid open. Beyond them was a chamber like none I had ever seen. Massive, circular, with copper tubing running along the walls like veins. In the center stood a podium, and behind it a man in green gloves. "Marwick," Holmes said softly. The man turned slowly. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, you are precisely on time." Holmes stepped forward. "You orchestrated all of this, Rivington's disappearance, Miss Vale's warning, Falk's abduction." Marwick smiled. "The symphony is not yet finished. And yet you played your hand too early." Holmes nodded to Lestrade, who stepped into the room with a pistol raised. Marwick showed no fear. "You cannot stop it," he said. "The music has already been rehearsed." Holmes's voice was calm. "But not performed." Marwick's face twitched, just once. Holmes held up the final movement. "This is the key, is it not? Without this, your signal is just silence." Marwick's hands curled slowly. "You don't understand what I've built." "Oh, but I do," Holmes replied. "A symphony not of sound but of signal, and I intend to end it before the overture begins." Chapter 7. A Symphony of Silence. Marwick stood motionless beneath the chamber's arched copper dome, his pale features lit by the wavering glow of the lanterns. The air in the underground vault vibrated faintly, as though the walls themselves anticipated some great resonance. Lestrade's pistol remained fixed on him, but Holmes kept his gaze trained on the strange array of pipes and tuning forks that surrounded the central podium. "This," Holmes said softly, "is the Orchestra of Shadows." Marwick's voice was low but clear. "It is not an orchestra, Mr. Holmes. It is a broadcast engine, an instrument of awakening. When played, its sound will reach beneath the surface of this city, beyond the walls, under the river, into places you can scarcely imagine." "And what lies in those places?" Holmes asked, folding the final movement and placing it carefully in his coat. A cell of men? A message for spies? Marek tilted his head. Not men, memories. Holmes's brow lifted slightly, though his tone remained dry. Ah, so we've moved from music to mysticism. Marek smiled thinly. You think me mad, but what is madness but genius without a stage? London has always been a symphony of noise, bells, trains, footsteps, commerce. And within that chaos I composed order. Beneath your streets lie forgotten corridors, resonant with potential. One sound, one note, can wake the buried mind of a city. Holmes glanced around the chamber. I see copper wiring, tuned pipes and hydraulic valves. Ingenious, certainly, but even genius must bow to reality. You require the final score to complete your sequence, and I assure you I shan't be lending you mine. Marek's hands clenched. I wrote that piece. You cannot hold it hostage. On the contrary, Holmes said calmly, I believe I already have. With a curt nod, Holmes signaled to Lestrade, who moved swiftly. In less than a minute, Marek's hands were bound, and 2 constables stepped forward to search the chamber. But Marek made no move to resist. His eyes followed Holmes with eerie serenity. You still don't understand, he murmured. I never intended to play the piece myself. Holmes stiffened. Then who? But before Marek could reply, one of the constables called out from an adjoining corridor. Inspector, there's something you need to see. We hurried after him and emerged into a narrower, dimly lit annex branching from the main chamber. What we found froze the breath in my chest. There were beds, 4 of them, each occupied. Men lay sleeping or in some kind of trance, wires affixed to their temples, earpieces fitted tight. Their chests rose and fell in rhythmic unison. Their limbs twitched faintly with an eerie synchronicity as though following a silent conductor. Holmes stepped forward, examining their features. Folk, he said softly, recognizing the missing solicitor. And, yes, this one's from the Rivington Ensemble, a cellist. Lestrade swallowed. They look drugged. Holmes turned to the machinery beside the beds. Not drugged, entrained. These devices are sonic stimulators, pulsing inaudible frequencies that keep them suspended in a suggestive state. It's a form of deep hypnosis. Only instead of a hypnotist's voice, Marek used music. He bent to inspect the wiring. There's a timer here, linked to the main podium. Once activated, the harmonic signal would have flooded this chamber and awakened them all simultaneously. To do what? I asked, appalled. Whatever he told them. Sabotage, perhaps. Or something more insidious. Marek's music doesn't just instruct, it conditions, each note like a key unlocking a part of the mind. Lestrade stepped back, shaken. We need to get them out of here, and seal this place. Holmes nodded, but paused. Wait, someone's missing. I turned to him. Who? Rivington? The violinist, he's not here. But you said, I assumed wrongly, that he was among the missing. But no, Marek said he would not play the piece himself because someone else would. Someone trained. You think Rivington is going to perform the final movement? Holmes's jaw tightened. Number, I think he already has a stage prepared and an audience assembled. It was nearly midnight when we arrived at St. Martin's Cavern, the disused underground concert venue once used during the Blitz for performances and morale. It had been closed to the public for years, yet the entrance was unlocked and a trail of footprints led down the damp stone steps. Holmes moved quickly, lantern in one hand, revolver in the other. Marek's engine was only a prototype, he said, a tuning fork. The real concert is here. We reached the central chamber and found ourselves standing at the rear of a vast circular space. In the center stood a raised platform, and on it, dressed in black, holding a gleaming violin, stood Nathaniel Rivington. The audience was silent. Dozens of people, seated in pews salvaged from a nearby chapel, eyes closed, heads slightly bowed. They were not ordinary concert-goers. Their stillness was unnatural. Holmes stepped forward. "Rivington!" The violinist opened his eyes slowly. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice serene, "I've been expecting you. Put the instrument down. This performance is over." Rivington shook his head. "On the contrary, it is only beginning. The last movement is written, the chamber is primed, the conductor may be gone, but the orchestra remains." I raised my revolver, but Holmes stopped me. "No, Watson, that would risk triggering panic, or worse." He turned to Rivington. "You don't have to do this. Marwick's spell is broken. The others, Falk, the cellist, they are safe. But I am not one of them," Rivington said. "I am his crescendo, his final note." Then he raised the violin and began to play. The music that followed was unlike any I had ever heard. It was at once beautiful and terrible, full of discordant resolution and rhythmic silence. The chamber trembled. The audience stirred as one. Holmes stepped forward. "Listen to me, Nathaniel. This is not a concert. It is a command. You must stop before—" And then something remarkable happened. Rivington's bow stuttered. He faltered. A single note missed. The audience twitched, uncertain. Holmes seized the moment. "You're not playing the true final movement. You're missing a bar, aren't you?" Rivington's hands trembled. He left it unfinished. He said I would know it when the time came." "And do you?" Holmes asked gently. Silence. The violin dropped to the floor, and with it, the spell broke. The audience blinked, as if waking from a dream. Murmurs rose, confusion returned. One man began to sob. Holmes moved to Rivington and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's over," he said quietly. "The music is done." Chapter 8. The Last Note. The morning after the events beneath St. Martin's Cavern, the light of day seemed to strip away the darkness that had hung over London. The city was silent in its usual bustle, but there was a quiet sense of resolution in the air, as though an ancient knot had been untangled. As I walked beside Holmes through the streets of Baker Street, I could not help but reflect on the uncanny events that had transpired in the last few days. Holmes had not spoken much since we left the cavern, his mind still churning through the many threads of the case, seeking the hidden patterns. He was a man who never allowed a mystery to remain unsolved, no matter the danger. As we entered Baker Street and sat in the study, Holmes poured himself a cup of tea and looked at me with his usual penetrating gaze. "It is done, Watson, but the story is not yet over." I raised an eyebrow. "You mean Marwick's plot?" "Yes," Holmes said. "The surface has been scratched, but the true nature of Marwick's scheme requires further analysis." I leaned forward, eager to understand. "But surely Marwick's operation has collapsed, the violinists are freed, Rivington has stopped playing, and the machinery beneath Gough Street is dismantled." Holmes placed his teacup down with precision. "It was never about the music itself, Watson, or the violinists. It was about something deeper, something long buried." "Buried?" I echoed, confused. "But Marwick's aim was to use the final movement to awaken men. His devices, the hypnosis, it all pointed to that, didn't it?" "Indeed," Holmes said, his tone quiet, almost reflective. "But the final piece, the symphony, the awakening, was always a smokescreen. The real agenda was far subtler, yet much more dangerous." I stared at him, perplexed. "Go on." Holmes paused, his sharp gaze fixed on me as if weighing my understanding. "Marwick, in his search for significance, came across something far older than himself. He uncovered an echo of a forgotten war, a movement buried in the past, one of the many suppressed attempts to overthrow the monarchy in the 19th century. A series of underground cells hidden away under the city were once poised to disrupt the natural order of London's politics. Marwick's genius, or madness, was to believe that he could bring these forces back to life. You mean these underground agents? Yes, exactly. But it was never about a physical uprising, Watson. It was about resonance. Marwick had learned how to tap into the city's latent infrastructure, its very bones, and awaken a form of mass suggestion. When combined with his score, the right frequencies would have reverberated across London, stirring the minds of those with certain predispositions. A signal, if you will, sent to awaken a latent network of revolutionaries. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and he nearly succeeded. Holmes nodded. Yes, nearly. But what stopped him? Holmes stood and paced the room, deep in thought. You and I, Watson, are well aware of the power of suggestion, but we must also acknowledge the limitations. Marwick's plan was not foolproof. His system, though brilliantly conceived, had one significant flaw. I leaned forward. What flaw? The human element, Holmes said, his voice steady. It depended on perfect execution and absolute control of the participants. Yet people are unpredictable no matter how well they are conditioned. Rivington faltered at the critical moment. His hesitation caused the disruption of the signal. I blinked. But how did you know? How did you know Rivington would be the one to break the spell? Holmes smiled faintly. It was his connection to the music, Watson. He was always the most gifted musician of the group, Marwick's star player, if you will. I suspected that Rivington, despite his conditioning, would not be able to surrender entirely to the machinery of control. The final movement was the key to breaking the cycle, but only someone with the most finely tuned sensibilities could feel the wrongness of the composition. Rivington's training as a violinist gave him the capacity to recognize the false note. And that was what allowed him to stop. Exactly. Without Rivington's subconscious recognition of the dissonance, the signal would have completed its course. But once he faltered, the cycle was broken. The tuning of the machines was disrupted. I shook my head, still trying to process everything. But why did Marwick allow it? Why did he not ensure Rivington played the movement to completion? Holmes looked at me with a faint, knowing smile. Marwick underestimated the human element, Watson. He believed he had orchestrated every possible detail, but even the finest composer cannot predict the mind of his performer. Marwick's arrogance was his undoing. He thought himself too clever, too invincible. It was that overconfidence that led him to allow Rivington too much freedom. He did not anticipate that Rivington's trained ear would be able to discern the flaw. I felt a sense of relief, but also deep admiration for Holmes's sharp analysis. You knew it all along, didn't you? I suspected it, Holmes replied, his eyes narrowing. But I needed the final confirmation. The key was always in the final score, the missing note. And once we had it, the rest of the puzzle was easy to complete. I leaned back in my chair. So Marwick's plan was always a gamble, a risk that failed at the last moment. Holmes nodded, his expression growing more serious. A gamble, yes, but a dangerous one. Had Rivington succeeded, London would have been plunged into chaos. Marwick's symphony would have signaled a new age of discord, where suggestion and manipulation replaced reason. He would have unleashed a wave of rebellion that could have torn apart the very fabric of society. I shuddered at the thought. And now? Now, Watson, Holmes said, we wait. Marwick will be taken into custody, of course, but the true danger has passed. His underground cells, those men who might have been awakened, are no more than shadows now. London remains intact. But the memory of the music? I asked. Holmes looked out of the window where the morning sun had finally begun to pierce through the clouds. The memory of the music, Watson, will always remain, but it is no longer a call to arms. It is only a reminder that the power of suggestion, once unleashed, can never be fully erased. We must always be vigilant. I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Holmes turned back to me, his usual calm demeanor restored. But there is one last piece of the puzzle, Watson. I raised an eyebrow. Hey, what is it? Holmes held up the leather-bound folio. Marwick's final score was not just a map to a revolution. It was his confession, the key to understanding his mind. I stared at him in confusion. Holmes smiled. You see, Watson, the true final movement of the symphony was not meant to be played. It was meant to be read. I took the folio from his hands. And what does it say? Holmes's eyes twinkled. The music, Watson, was never truly for the violin. It was for the listener. I opened the score, and there, at the very end, was a single phrase. The end is the beginning.